My name's Josiah. I want to share with you a little bit about the story of my encounter with Jesus, what I learned about him and about his resurrection, and what it means to me and how it's changed my life, and hopefully for you to understand a little bit better the power of his resurrection and how it can make a difference in your life. So I want to begin the story. I was 22 and I was in the city of Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover, the great festival of the Jewish people when we gathered together to remember the great work of God to defeat the powers of Egypt and bring his people out of slavery. And so we gathered every year, but that year was different. Some amazing things happened. On the first day of the week, on that Sunday, this rabbi from Nazareth, this man named Jesus, came riding into the city on a donkey. And the people gathered and they waved palm branches and they threw their coats down. And many claimed that he was maybe the king, the Messiah, the Christ that the people had been waiting for to rescue us once again, like on the first Passover. And the week went by and I heard rumors that he had gone to the temple. And there was a conflict between him and the religious leaders as he claimed that the temple was meant to be a house of prayer. And he challenged them, which apparently upset the religious leaders. Because later in the week, Jesus was arrested. And from what I learned later, he was put on trial, although it really wasn't much of a trial. And on that Friday, by the authority of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, he was executed, crucified, hung on a cross. Certainly not the first man to be put on a cross. This was way that Rome demonstrated its power, exerted its influence, showed that they were the ones who were in charge. But the story didn't end there. And I suppose you know that because that's why you're here this Sunday morning. Because that first day of the week following that, we're told that some women went to the tomb. And one of them went in and they found it empty. And then Jesus appeared to her and told her that he had risen from the dead and to wait for this. Now, I heard rumors of this, and I wasn't sure what was going on, and the stories circulated, and I didn't know much about it. And I went on and kind of wrote it off as, well, it's an interesting story. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But later, a few years later, maybe I met some followers of Jesus, followers of the way. And one of them began to explain to me who this Jesus was and what it was all about. He took the stories of Jesus and connected them to all the stories that I had learned growing up. The stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promises to God. And it made sense to me. He said, Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Christ. He's the anointed one, the one that God sent to rescue us. And so I too became a follower of the way. And I began to put together the pieces, and that's what I want to do this morning, is put together some of the pieces from my childhood and other stories of Jesus. And they may seem a little disconnected at first. Some of them may seem a little odd. Stories and things that you may not think about much or talk much about. But as I put them together, it gave me a better picture of who Jesus is and his power. So the first story begins when I was 5. My grandfather had passed away, and so the family gathered together, and we prepared his body for burial. And over the course of that, my parents were explaining to me some of the teachings that Moses had given through the Torah, the books of instructions of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These books that when we encounter a corpse, we have to go through a purification. We have to be cleansed, and there was this water mixed with ashes and hyssop branches and this cleansing that went on. And this was all part of the process after we had prepared his body. Now, you can imagine a 5-year-old, and all these strange things are going on. And what is it that children are very good at? Asking questions, right? And what's one of the favorite questions for a child to ask? Why? And so I asked my parents, why are we doing this? Why do we have to have 3 baths this week and all these different things going on? And they sat me down and they said, well, God gave these instructions to Moses. And this was what happened when you handled a corpse, that you had to be cleansed of this. And I nodded my head, and then I asked, why? Why do we do this? And so, thankfully, I had some patient parents. And they went on and they explained to me what this was all about. That this cleansing had to do with what they called impurity, which was a big word for a 5-year-old. I didn't understand fully what they meant. This impurity that we took on because we had contacted a corpse. And so I asked, well, why does that matter? And so they went on and they explained. They said, well, see, the impurities are something that can affect the temple, the presence of God. The temple was this place where God's presence on earth was. And when there was impurity, it built up in the temple. And if the temple became too infected, it might cause God to leave the presence of the temple. And so we had been given all these rites and rituals, all these different things to cleanse ourselves so that we didn't enter into the presence of God with these impurities, to cleanse the temple. And so I said, oh, okay. But why does a dead body make us impure, I said. And my parents sighed deeply. And they went on and they explained. They said it will make more sense later, but all these things that cause impurity, and that wasn't the only one. There were certain skin diseases and other things in life. And it wasn't that you did anything wrong necessarily to contract an impurity. I mean, we did what we were supposed to when we prepared my grandfather. Sometimes you got sick. Sometimes things happen, and these all cause impurity. It was just part of everyday life. And that's what my parents explained to me. They said these impurities are part of the world in which we live. They called them the forces of death, reminders of our mortality. And so each time we encounter one of those, we cleanse ourselves to go into the presence of the living God so that these impurities don't build up in the temple. And there were other acts we would do, not only the washings, but we had these people called priests. And the priests were the protectors of the temple. And sometimes my parents would bring a sacrifice of an animal that would be slaughtered, and then some of the blood would be taken in to the temple, and the blood acted as a cleansing agent to remove these impurities. And so we did this year after year, a way to remind ourselves of God's presence, because we wanted God to live with us. We wanted God's presence there, and we knew that in some way these impurities affected that. And so because of our desire to be in relationship with God, we went through these ceremonies, these rituals, these rites to keep ourselves clean. And so I had all these in the back of my mind as I was growing up. All these strange things about purity and impurity. And then I began to hear the story of Jesus and how he connected with all these things. And so I learned some of the stories about Jesus. I knew about his coming into Jerusalem. I knew about his crucifixion and his resurrection. But there were other people who had traveled with him, who told the stories of the things that he did and said. They told about his teachings, these incredible teachings about love and the kingdom of God, but also the great acts of power he did, things we would call miracles. And so I want to tell you about a couple of those because there's a connection between all of those. One of the first ones that the men who wrote down these stories, one of them was a man named Mark. He wrote down the story of Jesus' life. And one of the first stories he tells is Jesus' encounter with a man who had a skin disease called lepra, an infection of a skin disease. And this was one of the things that Moses had written about, that when you had a skin disease, you went to the priest and you showed yourself, and the priest would examine you. And if you were clean, then you had to go through a series of washings. Jesus encounters such a man. And the man longs to be clean. And Jesus touches him and he makes him clean. But here's the thing. When the priest came and you came to the priest with one of these skin diseases, they couldn't get rid of the skin disease for you. They could just tell you if you were clean or not. They could just give you this. When Jesus encountered the man, the source of the infection went away. He didn't just deal with the effects of this, he dealt with the source of it. This power went out. It was as if his holiness went into him and cleansed it all. Second story. It's really kind of two stories together. Jesus one day was approached by a man named Jairus. whose daughter was sick. And so Jairus came to Jesus and asked if Jesus would come and heal his daughter. And so Jesus began to make his way to see this little girl who was sick. And on the way, Jesus was pressing through the streets, and the crowds were all around him. And in the crowd was a woman. And she had had this disease which caused her to bleed, and it had been going on for years, and she had exhausted all her resources, all her money, and she longed to be clean so that she too could go to the temple, so she could be in the presence of God. And she heard about Jesus, and she reached out and she touched him. And Jesus stopped. You see, because he felt the power go out from him, and it stopped her bleeding. She became clean. Again, it didn't just wash her on the outside, but it actually changed what had happened inside her that was causing these impurities. It was sort of a strange thing to think about, that Jesus was in some way this walking, living source of incredible holiness power. I think about it this way. When you have something that's clean and something that's dirty, and you bring the clean thing in contact with the thing that's not clean, the thing that's dirty, what happens? They both dirty, aren't they? They both come out. And that's how we often think of it, even in terms of this holiness and the purity. When the impure contacted the pure, it affected the thing that was pure and made it impure. Jesus worked a different way. His purity was so powerful, his holiness, his power was so powerful, that when it came in contact with that which was impure, it wiped it away. Oh, remember I told you about the little girl who was sick? Well, by the time all this had happened with the woman, some friends of Jairus came and said, "Don't bother now, she's passed away." And Jesus said, "No, we're going to go see." And so Jesus went on to the house where the little girl was, and he went into the room, and he took her by the hand, and he told her to sit up. And she got up. Again, the power of death was overcome by Jesus. She who was a corpse, this great source of impurity, was overcome by the power of Jesus, that he brought her back to life. But it wasn't just the ritual impurities he dealt with, because earlier I said, remember, ritual impurities didn't have anything to do with something wrong. Being ritually impure didn't mean you had sinned. But there were sins still. You could sin. And some of those had sacrifices and offerings, some of them didn't. But Jesus not only cleansed people of their impurities, he also forgave them. There was a story of a man who couldn't walk, and his friends brought him to see Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, "Your sins are forgiven." He had that much power where he could cure, he could heal, even take away the sins of people. But all these were skirmishes, if you will, skirmishes that led up to the final confrontation. Back to that story of Passover when Jesus was brought before Pilate and hung on a cross to be crucified. Because in that moment, the powers of death were laid on him and overwhelmed him. But 3 days later, when God raised him from the dead, it was as if to say, no, even the power of death, Jesus has greater power then. And so all these stories were swirling in my mind, all these stories of impurity, and you're thinking, oh, finally you're talking about Jesus. I thought we were going to just talk about impurity all day long. But here's where it all begins to connect together, because we had had a hope as a people that one day God would make things right. And that's exactly what happened in Jesus. That these stories of impurity, for me, were ways that I began to understand the power of Jesus to change the world and to make all things new. The power of Jesus to wipe away the forces of death, to wipe away all that was mortality, to overcome all those things. Not just simply encourage us to come back month after month, year after year, to wash on the outside, but the power of Jesus to change us on the inside. Now, my guess is you probably spend very little time thinking about purity and impurity. Truth is, I don't think much about it anymore either. But on the other hand, my guess is what sometimes comes to mind are the forces of death, the things that separate us from God. Maybe it's something you did, something you said, some thought of yours, some sin that runs deep, and because of that, you feel this separation between you and God. Like the ritual impurities, you feel this separation where you can't go into God's presence and you feel that anguish. Or maybe it's the forces of death. It's the death of a loved one, of a friend. Maybe it's your own mortality you're thinking about. Maybe you simply look around the world and you see the forces of death at work, the forces of injustice and the power that comes with it. If you see those and when you see those, what I would encourage you to do is to turn and look to Jesus. Because in Jesus, we see his power over the force of death. When we celebrate on Easter Sunday that God raised Jesus from the dead and he walked out of the tomb, that in him was new creation, it was a reminder that Jesus had the power over even the forces of death. So when you feel that sin, that shame deep inside of you, the risen Jesus has the power to forgive. He comes and he offers you forgiveness when you put your faith, when you put your trust in him, when you give your life to him. He gives you forgiveness as a free gift. And not only does he forgive you, but then, remember the presence of God, he invites you. He goes into the presence of God and then he invites you too to come into the presence of God. No longer needing someone to go between you like we used to have the priests do, but he instead goes in and he invites you in. And Jesus himself even prays for us. It's also the forces of death to realize that Jesus has overcome every one of those. When we fear death, and yes, there is still death in the world, but the resurrection of Jesus reminds us that death does not have the final word. But that the power of Jesus is one that can even overcome that. That for all those who put their trust, their faith in him, that there is life and life eternal, that there is a resurrection hope beyond all of this. That he changes not just the outside, but the inside. And so even when we deal with our sin, going back to that, when we deal with our sin, that Jesus not only forgives us of our sin, but he lives inside of us and begins to change our hearts. Like Jeremiah and like Ezekiel, the prophets, begins to change our hearts to be people that he has called us to be. So as we celebrate the resurrection, the story of the resurrection is not just about one man who was raised from the dead 2,000 years ago. That would be a good story. But it's a great story. Because that same power that raised Jesus from the dead, that same power of Jesus that overcame the forces of death in his life, and then in his own death as he trampled over death by death, and then in his resurrection finally defeated death, that same power is available for each and every one of us and works inside of us. And that's why we gather on an Easter Sunday. To say that that same power is at work for us, that Jesus is the one who has conquered death. He has conquered the devil, he has conquered sin, and he gives it as a gift to us to live into that life which he offers. So may we hear that story again today. May we be reminded again of the power of Jesus, of the love of Jesus, that overcomes the forces of death, that overcomes it all that opposes us, and offers us new life. So just as I found new life in Jesus, just as I found in him the one that gives hope, the one that gives peace, the one that gives comfort, the one that assured me that I too would be raised again one day, that I too could be forgiven, that his power that cleansed people while he was on earth can also cleanse me and give me that same victory. Just as I found it. My prayer, my hope is that you too might find it. That you might find in Jesus' victory over death, his love and his power, which is also for you. Amen.